Welcome to the Canon Connected, where we read the connections, see the connections, and study the connections of the Bible. It's an honor to have you here with us at the Canon Connected for day number 44, and today we're going to do the second half of a series on the speeches or diatribes of Job and his book. We covered Job's speeches and the things that he says, a few of them in other readings. But the last couple of days, we've been laser focused just on the things that Job says. In the next couple of days, we'll do the other half of what you'll find from Job chapter 3 to chapter 37, which is Job's friends. And we're going to delve deep into the topic, and I'm going to have guest speakers for this one that can definitely speak to this better than I can, of just how bad God followers, Christians, are at counseling hurting people, because we talk too much and we give cliches and platitudes and we don't understand and we try to fix the problem. And in the worst cases, we actually even blame the person for the suffering that they're experiencing. But today we want to, again, conclude the Job half of this bulk of the book by the things that Job says. And we're going to notice some connections today, not just between what Job says today and the passages that we studied today from Job 19, 22, and 23 and all that, but also we're going to see connections from yesterday and the things that we saw that Job said then as well. In Job 19, I really am going to read a lot of this because so much of what Job 19 says is, again, the very things that we talked about yesterday that carry over into today. One, the idea that Job is just miserable and he just wants to cry out in pain, but also this idea that he thinks God is wrong in as far as his justice and how he is being treated and how he essentially, I don't think we need to water this down or try to tweak it at all, but he blames God for what he's going through. And it's a very, again, tough thing to read, okay, if you're not experiencing it, but when you've gone through something like this, it's highly possible, that you absolutely resonate with this. But chapter 19 says, Then Job answered and said, again, this is a back and forth between him and his friends, so that's why it says that he answered, How long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? So that's one of the things from yesterday as well, that Job's friends were awful, okay? And we're definitely going to see that the next 2 days, okay? And talk, again, very practically in 2026 America, what Job's friends looks like in our world for us. He says, These 10 times you have cast reproach upon me, and you are not ashamed to wrong me. And even if it were true that I have erred, my error remains with myself. Job's basically telling him, mind your own business. If indeed you magnify yourselves against me and can make my disgrace an argument against me, and know that God has put me in the wrong and closed his net about me. Behold, I cry out violence. Something's wrong, okay? But I am not answered. I call for help, but there is no justice. And I'm going to pause there because he's going to go on and on about this, and I may not read much more of this chapter, but I think it's important to note here that I've said a couple of times in the previous days that you would think Job deserved a shepherd to come to him in Job 38 and to comfort him and to carry him in his arms and to say, you did so good. Thank you so much for worshiping me, even whenever you were going through the worst suffering imaginable with the loss of children, loss of health, loss of support of his wife, loss of financial resources. And he gets a whirlwind instead. And I won't claim to understand, all of that, perfectly, and I won't claim to be able to try to explain it all, but I do think you can see this, that the reason why God feels the need to correct Job, I think we're okay to say that it's because over and over and over and over again that we have seen in these readings, Job calls God's justice into question, and God does not take too kindly to that, okay? So God definitely feels the need. I think this is a safe interpretation in Job 38, 39, 40, and 41, most of those chapters. Job speaks a little bit in there, to correct Job, to set him straight, and to tell him, never question my justice again. All right, and it's very interesting because the end of the book says that Job's friends speak what's wrongly about God. God says this, and Job didn't. But I don't think we can take that as an absolute statement because it definitely seems obvious to me that Job says things about God that are wrong, and maybe it's that God's understanding of it. And yet, even if God was compassionate and understanding about Job saying the things that he said, the fact that he says things here like, again, there is no justice whenever I go to God, God seems offended by that at the end of the book. So please understand, we have great freedom to express ourselves to God when we're in pain, but we also have to remember, okay, things that are just simply not true are things that will receive correction from God, and then we do get into the area of human sin and human failure. But Job continues to say things like this. He breaks me down on every side, chapter 30 or chapter 19, verse 10. And I am gone, and my hope he has pulled up like a tree. I really believe in Job 13:15. He says, though he slay me, I will hope. But here he seems to says the opposite. We've talked about that a little bit. We're going to see that more today. He says some other things that really got my attention. I called him my servant, but he gives me no answer. In other words, he still has his servants, but nobody respects him anymore. I must plead with him with my mouth for mercy. My breath is strange to my wife, and I am a stench to the children of my own mother. Okay, so his own family, again, has rejected him, and this is, again, about as low as a person can get. It's why, again, I think he's, cursed the day he was born and expressed the desire to die. Have mercy on me, O you my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Why do you, like God, pursue me? Why are you not satisfied with my flesh? If I say how we will pursue him, and the root of the matter is found in him. Be afraid of the sword, for wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment. Then Job 23. Oh, this is something that, again, contrasts to other things that Job says. Again, he's all over the place. He goes back and forth with some of these ideas. We saw a little bit of this yesterday, but it's very accentuated today. He says in chapter 23, today my complaint is bitter, and my hand is heavy on account of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with argument. So he's saying again, he wants a trial with God. He wants to lay out his case before God. He wants to win this argument, not because of some, intellectual reason, but because he is in pain and he needs God to answer him and fix this. And so he thinks God does not understand. Okay, I don't think he really thinks that, but God's not acting like he understands that Job is righteous. So he wants to explain himself to God in a courtroom type setting. That's the kind of language he's using. And yet, one of the things that he is saying right now is, I can't find him. All right? He says in verse 8, behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backwards, but I do not perceive him. On the left hand, when he is working, I do not behold him. He turns his right hand, and I do not see him. And some translations say east and west. That's the idea. In other words, wherever I go, I can't find God, which contrasts to other things where he says where God's hand is too heavy on me, all right? And I find it very interesting that sometimes when we're going through suffering, it's very easy for us to think God is absent, but other times, as we've seen in Job, sometimes it's not that God is absent, it's that he is too close to us. It's like we want God to back off a little bit, because when God is so close to us, we get a sense of just how holy and awesome and mighty and terrifying he is. And so Job in one chapter is like, God's hand is too heavy on me. He wants him to back away, and in another chapter he's like, I can't find him anywhere to explain my case before him. Then Job 24, again, some of the same things that we've seen from yesterday. Again, verse 12 is one of the ones I highlighted. From out of the city, the dying groan, and the soul of the wounded cries for help. Listen to this. Yet God charges no one with wrong. Again, he's calling God's judgment into question, not just about him, but about everything around him, including animals. Job obviously cares a lot about animals. If you read day 2, you may remember there was a lot of references, and really the whole of creation, Job came up a lot. And at the end of this chapter, he says, yet God prolongs the life of the mighty by his power. They rise up when they despair of life. He gives them security, and they are supported, and his eyes are upon their ways. Is this the same guy that we've been listening to through so many things we've talked about the last couple of days? They are exalted a little while and then are gone. They are brought low and gathered up like all others. They are cut off like their heads of grain. If it's not so, who will prove me a liar and show me there is nothing in what I say? So he's actually talking about the ways in which God does do good things. And again, it's the same person, same passage. We saw this a lot with Psalms that go back and forth. And then Job 26, a lot of the same things. In fact, one of the things I wanted to point out that's not a connected thing to these readings, but it does connect to how Elihu speaks in chapter 37, which we'll get to in a different reading, which connects to how God speaks in chapter 38 when he says in verse 14 of Job 26, behold, these are but the outskirts of his ways, and how small a whisper do we hear of him, but the thunder of his power who can understand? Elihu says that very same thing in Job 37:5. And God makes it clear that that's what he's doing in Job 38 when he comes at Job with thunder and he says, "You do not question me, okay? You can't understand all that I'm doing, all right? I feed the mountain goats, at 4 a.m. when you're asleep and have no clue what's going on." But God spoke all that through thunder, and Elihu says God thunders with his voice, doing mighty things we can't comprehend. We see a connection here that is not for today, but again, this is how the Bible is. Job, in all of the cloudiness and all the confusion and all the chaos and how he's all over the place, and God's too close, God's too far away. I question God's judgment. I want to die. And my friends are terrible. All of these things, somehow in this verse, he comes up with this sentence that Elihu acknowledges correctly and that God puts on full display. Who can understand the thunder of God's power? Interesting, again, not a connection within today, but connection overall. And I highlighted this from Job 27. Job again took up his discourse and said, "As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter." He's still blaming God. "As long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood and my tongue will not utter deceit." Job's hanging on to his righteousness for dear life. He's like, not only am I righteous and God has done me wrong and God has not given me justice, but I'm gonna keep on. And it's almost like he's being stubborn here. Typically, a person, hangs on to their integrity. It's because they're doing what's God-honoring, and maybe here he is. Maybe this is a gray area, but clearly he is, again, defending himself because he said this. If he doesn't get an arbiter or a defense attorney or whatever to go between him and God, he's going to make his case. And he says in verse 5, "Far it be from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me." And part of here is not even just talking to God. He's talking to his friends because his friends are saying, "You've obviously sinned." All right? So Job, brokenness, fussing, and all, hangs on to his integrity. And ultimately, we can say he hangs on to God, even though he had to be corrected at the end of the book. And the last thing that he says, this is how Job goes out on and on before God comes in and corrects him. These are Job's last words. "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me." So you can see to the very last point, Job never really turns around until God thunders at him in chapter 38. And then he's like, "I am nothing. I spoke out of turn. God, you know everything. You can't do anything wrong. And so I will repent in dust and ashes. I will shut up," is basically what Job says. But until that point, we see a lot of this from Job, which is why I think God needed to come in with the whirlwind and not as a gentle shepherd and carry him like a broken lamb. He needed to be set right, and that's hard. That's hard to accept. I'm explaining it that way because the Bible explains it that way. My mind wraps around it, but I have to admit my heart struggles with it still, and that's okay. I don't have to come to full understanding in my thoughts and emotions, everything about God. If I could, he wouldn't be much of a God, right? But we're committed on this podcast, this Beat Reading Plan, to the full counsel of God and trying to rightly divide the word of truth. And so these are the diatribes of Job. These are these sermons of Job to God. And they're not pretty, and they're ugly, and they're chaotic, and they're messy, but it is the reality of a person who is suffering, even truly one of the most blameless and upright people that's ever lived. Job was mentioned along with Noah and Daniel and Ezekiel 14 as people that God thought were supremely righteous, and that even if they lived among those people, they wouldn't be exiled. Those three men wouldn't, but the rest of the people would. So it's a mess, this whole thing about Job. He clearly is, he'd said what was right about God according to God at the end of the book, and yet he still needed correction. But I hope that, again, his speeches have brought some clarity to this idea of how a person mourns and grieves and laments, and how messy it is and how chaotic it is, and how we don't need to put everything in a box. But we are going to, again, for a couple of days, deal with this is a hard one too, but I actually find so much hope. I love the next 2 days and what we're going to talk about, because I think people know that even Christians today, even if we don't go as far as Bildad, Elihu, and Zophar did in accusing people who are suffering of sin, we still say some of the most ridiculous things sometimes when a person's hurting. And we feel like we've got to say something in order to fix it, something to fill the void that is just heavy with grief, and it's just not right. And so we'll talk about that the next couple of days. Job's friends and why they were wrong, with two very, very powerful testimonies from people other than me. So come back and be with us tomorrow as we continue to read the connections, see the connections, and study the connections. Thank you.